In the history of weapons, there have been thousands of different inventions. Some of them changed warfare forever. Others became legends because of their reliability and effectiveness. But there are also inventions so strange that it's hard to believe they ever existed. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most unusual pistols ever created, a weapon that didn't fire ordinary bullets. Instead, it fired tiny rockets. This pistol was called the Gyrojet. At first glance, it looked fairly normal, but inside, it used a technology that had the potential to completely change the future of firearms. The engineers who created it believed that traditional bullets would eventually become obsolete. They believed the future belonged to rocket-powered ammunition. The idea sounded so unusual that many people initially struggled to believe it could actually work. But the most fascinating part was that, at least on paper, the concept had enormous advantages: less recoil, less noise, and an entirely new way of firing a projectile. However, despite all of those promises, the project ultimately failed. Today, the Gyrojet remains one of the strangest experiments in the history of firearms. To understand why it was created and why it disappeared, we need to go back to the era of the Cold War. The 1960s were a time of incredible technological competition. The United States and the Soviet Union were competing in almost everything: in space, in science, and of course, in weapons development. It was a period when engineers constantly tried to invent something radically new. Traditional rifles and pistols had existed for decades. Weapons like the M16 rifle were becoming the standard for the US military. But some engineers believed that the traditional bullet was outdated technology. They asked a simple question: why do bullets have to rely on exploding gunpowder? Why not use a completely different method of propulsion? That question eventually led to one of the most unusual firearm projects ever attempted. In the early 1960s, a small company called MBA Associates began working on an experimental concept. The company had a reputation for exploring unconventional engineering ideas. One of their engineers proposed something that sounded almost like science fiction. He asked, "What if, instead of a bullet, we fired a miniature rocket?" At first, the idea sounded absurd, but when you looked closer, it actually made sense. Rockets were already widely used in military technology. They could accelerate on their own, and they didn't require extremely high pressure inside a gun barrel. If engineers could shrink a rocket down to the size of a bullet, they might create an entirely new type of weapon. This concept eventually became the Gyrojet. To understand why the Gyrojet was so unusual, we first need to understand how normal firearms work. When a shooter pulls the trigger, several things happen almost instantly. First, the firing pin strikes the primer at the base of the cartridge. This ignites the gunpowder inside the casing. The powder burns extremely quickly and creates high-pressure gas. This pressure pushes the bullet down the barrel. Within a fraction of a second, the bullet leaves the weapon at extremely high speed. Everything happens incredibly fast. But this system also has several disadvantages. There is strong recoil, the shot is very loud, and the weapon must withstand extremely high pressure. These were exactly the problems the engineers behind the Gyrojet wanted to solve. Gyrojet ammunition looked completely different from traditional cartridges. Instead of a brass casing and a bullet, the ammunition resembled a tiny rocket. Each projectile contained a small solid-fuel rocket engine. When the trigger was pulled, the rocket ignited and launched forward. But unlike a normal bullet, it did not reach full speed immediately. Instead, it accelerated gradually. This meant the projectile actually became faster after leaving the weapon. During the first few meters, the rocket moved relatively slowly, but as it continued flying, the engine kept pushing it forward. Eventually, it could reach speeds of around 380 meters per second. For a pistol-sized weapon, that was extremely impressive. On paper, the Gyrojet looked almost like the perfect weapon. First, it had almost no recoil. Because the rocket accelerated after leaving the weapon, there was very little pressure inside the barrel. Second, it was much quieter than traditional firearms. Most of the noise occurred after the projectile had already left the weapon. Third, the pistol itself had a very simple mechanical design. It contained far fewer moving parts than a traditional firearm. In theory, this meant the weapon could be lighter, simpler, and more reliable. At least, that's what the engineers hoped. The pistol itself had a very unusual design. Its internal mechanism was extremely simple. It did not rely on complex gas systems or traditional firing cycles. The ammunition was loaded into a magazine. When the shooter pulled the trigger, the rocket ignited and launched forward. One of the most interesting features of the rocket projectile was its angled exhaust ports. These tiny nozzles were positioned at slight angles. As the rocket engine burned, gases exited through these ports. This caused the projectile to spin while flying. That spin stabilized the rocket in flight. The concept was similar to the way rifling stabilizes a bullet in a traditional firearm. But instead of rifling inside the barrel, the Gyrojet used rocket exhaust to create rotation. When the first Gyrojet prototypes were completed, engineers began testing them. At first, the results seemed promising. The rockets launched successfully. They accelerated during flight exactly as designed. Watching the rockets fire was already impressive on its own. But during these early tests, engineers quickly noticed several serious problems. The biggest issue was the slow initial velocity. The most serious weakness of the Gyrojet appeared at short distances. Because the rocket accelerated gradually, it moved slowly right after leaving the weapon. At extremely close range, the projectile simply didn't have enough speed. In some tests, the rocket actually failed to penetrate the target. This sounds unbelievable, but it was true. At a distance of only a few meters, the rocket could sometimes bounce off instead of penetrating. This meant that in close combat, the Gyrojet was significantly weaker than a normal pistol. For military use, this was a major problem. Another serious issue involved accuracy. The rockets were supposed to stabilize themselves using the angled exhaust ports, but even a tiny manufacturing error could affect the trajectory. If one nozzle was slightly misaligned, the rocket might drift in flight. As a result, many shots became highly unpredictable. Sometimes the weapon was accurate. Other times, the rocket could deviate dramatically from the target. Compared to reliable firearms such as the M1911 pistol, this inconsistency was unacceptable. Despite these problems, the U.S. military still showed interest in the concept. The reason was simple. If the Gyrojet could be perfected, it might offer several advantages: quieter shots, minimal recoil, and a completely new weapon technology. Because of this potential, several prototypes were sent for additional testing. During the Vietnam War, a small number of Gyrojet weapons reportedly reached soldiers in the field. However, in real combat conditions, the problems became even more obvious. Soldiers noticed that the weapon was unreliable. Sometimes the rockets failed to ignite. Sometimes they flew inaccurately. And at close range, the power was often insufficient. Compared to proven weapons such as the M16 rifle, the Gyrojet felt more like an experiment than a practical combat tool. Another major issue was manufacturing. Producing the rocket ammunition required precise engineering. Each projectile had to be carefully machined. The exhaust ports had to be perfectly aligned. The rocket fuel had to be consistent. All of this made the ammunition extremely expensive. Meanwhile, traditional cartridges could be mass-produced cheaply and efficiently. From an economic perspective, the gyrojet began to look increasingly impractical. By the late 1960s, it had become clear that the gyrojet would not replace conventional firearms. There were simply too many problems. The weapon lacked reliability, the ammunition was expensive, and the advantages were smaller than originally expected. Eventually, the company MBA Associates stopped developing the system. The project quietly faded away. Today, the gyrojet is almost forgotten outside of firearm history circles. However, among collectors, it is considered extremely rare. Original examples of the weapon can sell for very high prices. The reason is simple. The gyrojet represents one of the most unusual experiments in the history of firearms. The gyrojet was a weapon that tried to bring the future into the present. It attempted to replace bullets with rockets. It promised quiet shots, minimal recoil, and a revolutionary new technology. But reality turned out to be far more complicated. Sometimes the boldest ideas simply don't work as expected. Even so, the gyrojet remains a fascinating chapter in the history of weapons. It reminds us that engineers will always search for new ways to change technology, even if those ideas seem strange at first. And sometimes, those strange experiments are what make the history of weapons truly interesting.